I want to cover the sequence of events that take place during a muscle contraction. And you can see this is figure 9.12. And I'm going to start up here with number one because since it's circular, you can start anywhere. But number one up here makes some sense. So what we've got going on so far is we've got the myosin heads. They've reached up and they've attached themselves to the actin fibers. And so when the ADP, and that's adenosine diphosphate and inorganic phosphate, when they actually release from this myosin head, that causes this myosin head to pull. So that ADP going away causes an action, which is actually the contraction or the shortening of that muscle. So we call this the working stroke or the power stroke, and that is that myosin head pivots and it pulls that actin filament toward the M line. So that's why they're actually overlapping each other. So that's what's taking place when we lose the ADP and the inorganic phosphate. So now you're set there with ADP gone. There's nothing on this myosin head, and it's pulled tight. So look, we have a new ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is going to come in and attach itself to the myosin head. Now, when it does that, that myosin head detaches. So we no longer have a cross bridge. We don't have that link anymore with our new ATP molecule. Now, ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is then split into ADP, adenosine diphosphate, plus one molecule of inorganic phosphate. And what that does is that allows my head then to reach up and to connect to the actin again. We're getting ready to pull again, aren't we? So again, ADP goes away, it pulls and shortens, new ATP comes in, it releases. And you see this is very cyclic. So here's one to think about. What would happen if your body didn't produce ATP? Okay, so you were here, you had my ADP come in, and it actually, it's gone away, so it causes the myosin to cock, and it's still hanging on. If ATP doesn't come in here, we're still stuck in this position, aren't we? Yeah. So we see this because the only time that you don't produce ATP is when you're dead. And so this is when rigor mortis sets in. So you're stuck with these myosin heads attached and pulling on the actin fibers. So there's rigor mortis for you. Okay, when we talk about a contraction, we are talking about the activation of myosin cross bridges. And we've got that shortening that occurs, and that creates that tension between the cross bridges. And then as the contraction ends, the cross bridges become inactive, and that tension generates, the tension that had been generated then declines, and relaxation is induced. There are two types of contraction in a skeletal muscle at the organ level. Contraction of muscle fibers, the cells, and the muscle organs is similar, but here's what we've got. The two types are isometric contraction. In an isometric contraction, we see increasing muscle tension, but the muscle does not shorten during the contraction. So if you're just holding a weight and it's not moving, you know the muscles are being used, but the muscles aren't shortening. That's isometric. Isotonic contraction, this is when we decrease the length of the muscle. So the muscle shortens then during a contraction. So please remember isometric and isotonic contractions. Moving on. This is a motor unit. A motor unit is a motor neuron and all the muscle fibers it supplies. Now, the number of muscle fibers per motor unit can vary from like 4 to several hundred, okay? Now, muscles that have fine movements, like in your fingers or your eyes, they have really small motor units. So then on the upside of that, or the other side of that, large weight-bearing muscles, like your hips and your thighs, these are gonna have very large motor units. So muscle fibers from motor units are spread throughout the muscle. So the contraction of a single motor unit can cause a weak contraction in the entire muscle. You can see from my picture here, this isn't the brain, I'm sorry, it's the spinal cord, that we've got a motor unit leaving our spinal cord, making its way into these muscle fibers. And then you can see these terminal ends of these neurons, how they spread out all over the place. So even though we've got a single nerve coming into the cell itself, we have a bunch of terminal ends going to all different spots on this muscle, okay? Because we want to make sure that we catch them all. So when it comes to a muscle, we have something which is called a muscle twitch. And a muscle twitch, this is a response to a muscle in a single, brief threshold stimulus. So in other words, we've got the muscle to actually contract. Now there are two phases. Now there are three phases to a muscle twitch. First of all, we've got the latent period. You can see that takes place in the first few milliseconds. And what's taking place is during the latent period, those myosin heads are reaching up and grabbing that actin. They're getting ready to pull, but they're not pulling yet. It's just that coupling taking place. The second period is the contraction period. So this is when the cross bridges are formed and the muscle shortens. And then finally, we have the period of relaxation. In this case, it's the calcium being reabsorbed and the muscle tension going back to zero. I think this is kind of interesting because we can look at muscle twitches in a variety of muscles. So take a look at these three. First one, boy, it's fast, isn't he? In this one, we hit the latent period in no time at all. We get the contraction, and then we get the relaxation. This is in the extraocular muscle. This is the lateral rectus. It's a muscle on the outside of your eye here. So eye movement, really fast, okay? That's compared to the gastrocnemius. That's the second one. This is the large calf muscle in the back of your shin. And you can see even that's pretty quick. And then we compare that to this big slow muscle. This is the soleus. The soleus is actually underneath or lies deep to the gastrocnemius in the calf. But all these muscles have different functions. And so for that reason, we see the muscle twitch comparisons being very different. Since we're looking at muscle twitches, take a look at this figure. So the arrows down here represent a stimuli. So that's that single stimuli getting the twitch to take place. And notice how the tension after the first few increase. Well, look at our stimuli, the intervals down here, half a second. So every half second, we're hitting this muscle with the stimuli. And you notice that my tension goes up and up and up. Well, think about that intracellular calcium. If we're not getting it picked up, we're leaving more calcium in that cell with every contraction. We're just dumping more and more and more in, and we don't take the time to pull it back out. So we've got a lot of calcium inside that cell. And so that's why you're seeing this tension, because we're incorporating more and more muscle fibers up to a certain point. Now, this stair stepping that you see here, this is called TREP, T-R-E-P-P-E. And it's that stair stepping as the muscle tension increases to a certain point, and eventually it does taper off and stops going higher and higher. Okay, so this is showing how many nerve fibers are being excited. Remember, nerve fibers are the individual threads of muscle cells, and you can see as we add the stimuli, we have to get to a certain point even to get to some muscle fibers to fire, but then when we get to maximum contraction up here, we are firing as many muscle fibers as we can. So that's what we're looking for. So when you're lifting heavy weights, you've got more muscles involved than if you're just lifting lightweight, something fine and easy. So, and again, it all has to do with the stimulus that we put on your muscles. Okay, I find this one of the most interesting graphs in this section. And what you're looking at, this is actually figure 9.15, so 915 in the text. And so we're using a single stimulus, and this results in a single contractile response, so one muscle twitch. And then we're changing as far as when we deliver that stimuli, okay? So when it comes to, there's my first one, my twitch. My next one up here is called wave summation. In wave summation, we don't let the muscle come back down and we hit it with the stimuli again, and look what happens. We actually see more muscle fibers get involved. And then we eventually bring it back down. Okay, so the next part up here, we hit it with stimuli and stimuli and stimuli. So we've got what's called unfused or incomplete tetanus. And in that case, we're still not letting it come down. But take a look if we really hit it with a lot of stimuli really fast. We get what's called fused or complete tetanus. In that case, we see no wavering. That muscle is locked up. Okay, so we've gone through the phenomenon of recruitment. We've brought more muscle fibers into play, and it's exactly what we're seeing here. And we're not letting the calcium reload. We're not putting more calcium into the muscle. Eventually, though, we do have to let the muscle take that calcium back up. Let's briefly talk about muscle tone. When it comes to muscle tone, this is the constant, slight contracted state of all the muscles. It doesn't produce active movements. Remember, we were talking about isotonic versus isometric contractions before. In muscle tone, you are in an isometric situation where you still have that constant contraction of your muscles, but they're not going anywhere. Muscle tone, if you think about that, if that muscle is being pulled just slightly, that's going to keep the muscle, first of all, it's going to keep it firm, healthy, ready to respond to stimulus, right? Because we've already got some calcium inside of that cell and it's ready to take off. So muscle tone is actually a benefit for us. That's why we need to be toned and fit. The other thing that we're talking about, the calcium dumping into your cells, when you warm up, we want to make sure that we get enough calcium inside your muscles that you're already starting to put that calcium in the muscles, so you've got a little bit of tension going on. Again, this is better for you as an athlete to keep those muscles ready to go. Okay, so that's muscle tone. I do want to talk about the types of muscles based on your use of ATP and how you do this. So we learned in biology that the mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cells, and we learned all about how ATP is formed in muscles, but we never did anything with that ATP. Well, now you can see from my class, here's where we use ATP and why that's important to know. But your body, your muscles are going to use ATP differently. Okay, first of all, it is going to be the only source that's used for a direct contractile activity. Okay, but now you're going to have different situations on how you actually create the ATP. And I want to get into that. And it has to do with anaerobic glycolysis. Now, anaerobic, without oxygen, anaerobic glycolysis was the first step in when we were taking glucose, making it and turning it into ATP. And so without oxygen, we don't make as much ATP. So it's very fast, very short, and it's not a good situation if you're a long distance runner. That's versus an aerobic respiration. With oxygen, we form so much more ATP. Well, if you're using ATP on these muscle fibers, like I've been showing you in figure 9.12, you know that you need a fair amount of ATP in your body, and it's important that you actually cover that. So anaerobic glycolysis, when a muscle contractile activity reaches 70% of the maximum, you end up bulging muscles or compressing blood vessels, so you're not getting good blood flow through there. Your oxygen delivery is impaired, and you have pyruvic acid is then converted over to lactic acid. So in other words, that's when you're feeling the burn. Lactic acid then, once it's in your bloodstream, it's going to diffuse back into the bloodstream. It's going to be picked up and used as fuel by the liver, the kidneys, the heart. It can be converted back into pyruvic acid by the liver, and then it can be used again to generate more ATP down the road. The only problem we run into is muscle fatigue. Muscle fatigue is when the muscle is in that state of physiological inability to contract. So muscle fatigue occurs when ATP production fails to keep pace with the ATP use. So we have this deficit of ATP causing contractures. And that's when we see lactic acid accumulating in the muscles, and we have an ionic imbalance that's present. So there are other things that are taking place during muscle fatigue. One of them is your sodium-potassium pumps can't restore the ionic balance quickly enough. So when it comes to low intensity of exercises, you know that produces actually a slow developing fatigue, so over time. But anyway, sometimes you can have a damaged sarcoplasmic reticulum. and that's going to affect how the calcium regulation is being played out in your muscles. That's interesting. Sometimes your vigorous exercise causes dramatic changes in your muscle chemistry. So for a muscle to return to a resting state, your oxygen reserves have to be replenished. Don't forget, I think I told you early on that inside your muscles, you have that one protein. It's called myoglobin. Myo is muscle. We learned that in the first video. Globin is like what you hear hemoglobin, that's attaching to oxygen. So in myoglobin in your muscles, that's a protein that's actually hanging on to extra oxygen in your muscle cells, ready for you to use to form ATP. So anyway, back to my oxygen debt. Your O2 reserve have to be replenished. That lactic acid has to be converted back to pyruvic acid. Your glycogen stores are going to have to be replaced. And ATP is obviously going to have to be resynthesized. So now, for oxygen debt, this is the extra amount of O2 is needed for all that to take place. So, in other words, what all this comes down to, breathe. Make sure you breathe. Weightlifters, breathe. Sprinters, breathe. Okay, my distance runners, I don't worry about you. You're fine. Heat production, and this is during muscle activity. Only 40% of the energy released in muscle activity is actually used as work. So that gives you 60%. And what's happening to that 60%? It's being given off as heat from your body. So you end up with dangerous levels of heat are actually building up in your body, but thankfully we prevent that buildup through radiation, the heat from the skin and through sweating. And so we get rid of heat. But if you ever wonder why is your body at 37 degrees Celsius, your skeletal muscles are producing that heat. So that's just all part of homeostasis. You can see that's the end of this section. And so I'm going to stop here for muscles.